This video discusses gun violence, in particular mass shootings, and including references to specific shootings which have happened in recent history. One of my friends shared this video on Facebook the other day. I tend to disagree with this friend a lot on political and social matters, but gun control is definitely something we're reasonably aligned on. The Facebook version of this obviously has the goofy "why gun control would never work in the US" tagline taking up much of the screen real estate, and to be honest I normally ignore anything which has one of those header bars and keep scrolling, but it was my friend's comment which caught my attention. I still believe gun control would work, but some interesting points about the stats. So dutifully, I watched the video to see what the stats in question were and which of them were interesting enough to partially sway a friend who's always had a similar point of view to mine. And what I found was that Wheeler often uses or misrepresents material which is true in some limited context and then tries to present a narrative out of the list by hoping that she's cycled through them too quickly to see which are actually relevant to the discussion at hand. The speed of the list is clearly intended to make it sound like an overwhelming body of evidence, and I can see how it might seem convincing if you don't look up any of the things Wheeler says in the video or spend too much time listening to the actual points being raised. The commonly used term for this is a gish gallop. I've linked the video in the description so that you can watch it yourself and ensure that I'm not misrepresenting the nature of the discussion.
She's not afraid to take on liberal.
The final point is an opinion piece segment at the end of Liz Wheeler's show on a right-wing American TV channel called One American News Network, or OAN, presumably because they ran out of space for the full acronym on the logo. Wheeler's video starts out with a clip of an interview with the New Zealand Prime Minister talking about gun control. This interview was conducted in the wake of the Christchurch mosque shooting and subsequent introduction of bans on certain automatic and semi-automatic weapons across New Zealand. Bear in mind that this is not the only approach to gun control, but it is the approach that New Zealand has taken. So, in the clip, the New Zealand Prime Minister says that she doesn't understand the American stance on gun control.
To be honest with you, I do not understand the United States.
The video itself is positioned as a response to this interview and this question in particular. However, you'll see that Wheeler does not actually open by responding to the video with an explanation of the situation itself, and instead pivots immediately to talking about one specific CNN article and arguing against that.
In the first 19 weeks of 2019, liberals claim there have been 15 separate school shootings.
So what we can see here is that rather than presenting the case against gun control, Wheeler's found a not particularly well written article and focused on arguing against that and then pretending that arguing with one person is the same as rebutting all arguments from anyone who holds that position. This is most clearly evidenced by the way that Wheeler switches from talking about the PM of New Zealand to talking about one CNN article to discussing this one article as the claims of the liberals, as if liberalism is one homogeneous group who's banded together to say, from now on, all our points are to be represented by Michelle Lau and Christina Walker, who are infallible representatives of all we have to say. With the caveat that this is one publication which is being argued against and not necessarily representative of the entire debate, let's look at the flaws of the article in question. I agree with her assessment of...
But they don't define what constitutes a school shooting.
Whoops.
If you look carefully at these 15 incidents they classify as school shootings, the incidents include drug deals, accidental shootings, incidents that happen near schools but are unrelated to the school itself, and a BB gun injury.
So let's go through these. I'm going to be very restrictive as well about the definition to legitimately try and rule as many as possible out using what I assume are the same methods she did. May the 7th, Savannah State University student shot in campus residential facility. Discountable, it was a university student. May the 7th, STEM School Highlands Ranch, 1 dead, 8 injured. Counted. May the 4th, shooting of an unaffiliated man outside a fraternity house. Discountable, this is irrelevant to any school or even a university really. April 30th, University of North Carolina, 2 dead, 4 injured. Semi-relevant, it was a university. April the 1st, 8th grade student shot another at Prescott High School in Arkansas. Counted. March the 27th, in Holmes in Mississippi. This one's discountable. A 10-year-old student was shot in the hand while riding a school bus and claims that another student on the bus shot him, but the school district said that the bus was targeted in a drive-by shooting. Now, if this student was shot by another student on the school bus, I could see the argument including it, even if it didn't happen on the school grounds themselves. However, there's no proof that it was another student. It could have just been a school bus being targeted in a drive-by shooting, which is a perfectly normal thing to happen in any society, and not a cause for concern about gun violence at all. March 7th, Grambling, Louisiana. Discountable. Accidental discharge, university campus, not relevant to the specific list of school shootings. Now, would it be implausible to say that reducing the number of guns would result in a reduction in the number of people injured by accidentally shooting each other? That one's left as an exercise for the reader. February 26th, Montgomery, Alabama, 17-year-old student was shot by another in their school gym. Counted. February the 12th, Kansas City, Missouri. Probably discountable. The student was shot when leaving a basketball game, so they waited for her to leave an actual school building before shooting her. February the 8th, Baltimore. Arguable. The shooter was an adult who entered the school to shoot a member of staff who works there. The shooter could have picked somewhere else easily enough, however, it was a shooting which happened in a school. Decide for yourselves whether you want to count this. January the 31st, Humble, Texas. Counted. Note that this has a qualifying factor that there was an attempt to buy drugs, so while this was a student shooting another at school, Wheeler implies that it shouldn't be counted. Presumably because she thinks you can't count a school shooting if the shooter thought they had a reason. January 31st, Memphis. Discounted. This is the BB gun incident she refers to. January 30th, Lithonia, Georgia. In the interest of adhering to Wheeler's approach, this one should probably be discounted. This person was running on the school track when they saw someone trying to break into their car. The victim was not a student and it happened out of school hours. Counting all shootings which happen on school campuses as school shootings would clearly be absurd because sometimes the victims are not even students. 25th of January, Mobile, Alabama. Debatable. At least one of the men in the altercation was not a student. 7th of January, Belmont, California. Discounted. The victim was shot outside an elementary school when he was actually a high school student, so it being counted as a school shooting on this list is just an accident of location. Now, I'd like to reiterate that I agree with Wheeler. This list is not a good representation of school shootings. A good half of these either are not school specific or involve universities rather than schools. Our conclusions, however, are somewhat different. I would say that while some of these are, for example, potential drive-bys targeting school buses or involve university rather than school students or whatever else, those sort of shootings in themselves should be a cause for concern. But my second takeaway from this is even if you say that school shootings are the only shootings you care about, that children being shot in school buses, people accidentally shooting each other in university dormitories, or the vast majority of gun crime which isn't even tentatively related to schools, even if you focus solely on the full-on Columbine-style student brings a gun to school and starts shooting other students indiscriminately style approach, how many of these would you think is an okay number to have in a year? How often do you think this happens in the US compared to countries with more stringent gun control, and what level of student-on-student shooting do you think is an acceptable normal amount? Wheeler's takeaway is instead that
schools in the US are actually safer now than they were 20 years ago. According to research by Northeastern University, 4 times as many children were killed in schools in the early 1990s than now.
As if perhaps there were too many school shootings in the 1990s, but now we've got it down to a sensible amount of students being murdered on campus and we should just stop fretting about it. But anyway, that's Wheeler's first argument against gun control. She found an article on CNN which overrepresented the number of school shootings and therefore guns are fine. Okay, so now we've got that aside over, Wheeler is actually ready to start responding to the Prime Minister of New Zealand. We're a couple of minutes in, but it's time to start.
Here in the US, 98% of mass shootings in the past 50 years have happened in gun-free zones.
This is from a 2018 analysis published by crimeresearch.org, a website which collates statistical analyses of crimes from a right-wing and particularly a pro-gun perspective. Now, if you look up the site itself, you can find further analysis of its reliability and biases in general, which are much too in-depth for me to go into here. Instead, we're going to ignore those factors and focus on specifically what it's telling you, what methods it's using to achieve that result, and how Wheeler then further interprets that to support the narrative she's promoting here. So, the article in question is called Mass Public Shootings Keep Occurring in Gun-Free Zones, 97.8% of attacks since 1950, having been renamed from the even snappier, more misleading information from Bloomberg's Everytown for Gun Safety on Guns, analysis of recent mass shootings showing how mass public shootings keep occurring in gun-free zones. This article focuses on a subset of all shootings by using the 1980 to 2013 FBI definition of mass shooting. This definition excludes those motivated by drugs or gang violence or those which were not part of any other crime. So, if you shoot 4 people during a robbery, that wouldn't count as mass shooting and therefore cannot apparently be used as an argument for gun control. It also only counts cases where at least 4 people were murdered. This is why it specifies the definition up until 2013, when the FBI changed their definition of mass shootings to count 3 or more people. Note that here we're only looking at cases where at least 4 people died. In fact, partway through this, they've changed from talking about mass shootings to mass killings, so none of the cases we looked at earlier would count because 1 death and 8 injuries doesn't meet this criteria. Again, Wheeler's flexible on the actual content of what she's talking about as long as it sounds like it reinforces her point. But the other point on this list is that we're only talking about public places like schools, hospitals, malls, houses of worship, movie theatres, government buildings and open spaces. So these are often places which would inherently have bans on having firearms anyway. It would be oversimplifying a little to say that in most schools where school shootings occurred, students weren't supposed to be bringing guns in the first place. But that is the general gist of this. In fact, the goal of this crimeresearch.org post is to argue against gun-free zones, presumably using the only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun approach. For a very limited subset of shootings in America, with a minimum number of deaths undertaken for the sole purpose of killing as many people as possible in public spaces, the gunmen chose places where potential victims were not expected to be armed. Now, this does indeed make a point about the specific method of gun control where you're allowed guns in some areas but not others. However, this is not the approach to gun control introduced in New Zealand. It's not the approach to gun control used in Australia. It's another approach to gun control which Wheeler finds easier to argue against, and so again here comes a biased and unrelated study, cherry-picked to form part of a narrative which only seems cursorily cohesive because it's presented as a short, unsourced talking head piece. Clearly the guns in those shootings weren't created inside the gun-free zones. There isn't a munitions factory inside a gun-free zone which people are sourcing weapons from pre-spree. People own guns outside the gun-free zone, and then they take them into the gun-free zone, and then they use them there to murder people. If you're not permitted to own a semi-automatic rifle anywhere in the country, then it's going to be significantly harder to procure and transport this to a nightclub or a cinema than it is if you're allowed to have it up until the door of said establishment but not inside. Similarly, Wheeler's next position is that
the majority of gun crimes in the US are committed with firearms that have not been purchased legally.
Again, this is unsourced in either the YouTube or Facebook versions of the video, but I went into this legitimately looking for sources which supported that argument so that I could examine them. The Mother Jones dataset, which uses the same mass shooting criteria found above, has a handy column which says in how many of the 110 shootings which fit the FBI mass shooting criteria, legally procured guns were used as part of the shooting. From this, we see that about 68% of those shootings used firearms which were procured legally, compared to 15% where the firearms were illegally acquired and 17% where the data on firearm purchase legality is not provided. Restricting this to the older 4+ dataset that's been used elsewhere in the video to see if that would at least align more closely with Wheeler's point is actually unhelpful, as it changes the proportion of mass shootings where legally acquired guns were used to 73%. But rewatching her phrasing, Wheeler has indeed moved the goalposts again mid-sentence. We aren't talking about mass shootings anymore. No more can we exclude shootings where other crimes were happening or where only 2 people died. So, expanding our search, I found this PolitiFact analysis of the claims of John Faso that most gun crime is committed by those who illegally possess guns. The basic outcome of this is that the statistic is true. Now, what hasn't been mentioned here is that there are mitigating factors. It should be inherently easier to illegally procure a gun in a country where the same type of gun is legal than in a country where anyone owning said gun would be inherently illegal. But also, yet again, and I think this is important to emphasise, Wheeler is no longer arguing against the anti-assault weapon viewpoint which the Prime Minister of New Zealand's changes address. Rather, she's just arbitrarily picked another straw man of what someone who is pro an ethereal and non-specific form of gun control might be arguing, and used these otherwise irrelevant statistics to lay the proverbial smackdown on this pretend argument.
Even when you ban guns, look at what happened in London. The murder rate is now higher than the murder rate in New York City.
For context, while it was already more stringent than the US, the UK is another of those countries to tighten gun control in the wake of a shooting. In 1996, in Dunblane in Scotland, the UK experienced its first and only school shooting. In the wake of that, most parts of the UK introduced tighter gun control than was previously in place. This is an interesting one for a couple of reasons. For one, she says now, when she's specifically talking about February to March 2018. I know it's early 2018 she's talking about, because that's the specific outlier period where there were more murders in London than in New York. You can find a lot of information about this because of how much it was discussed, because of how unusual it was. To present this as if it's representative comparative rates in general between the two cities, let alone the countries as a whole, is willfully disingenuous. Looking at broad trends here, you can see that the murder rate in New York is falling, but the two cities are still not close to equal overall. In 2017, for example, there were 1.2 homicides per 100,000 people in London and 3.4 homicides per 100,000 people in New York. Nor does New York have a particularly high murder rate for the United States. According to the list of 2017 crimes collated by the FBI Uniformed Crime Report statistics, New York had the aforementioned 3.4 murders in non-negligent homicides per 100,000 people, compared to a high of 66.1 per 100,000 people in St. Louis. Clearly, there are a number of significant factors driving this which are well beyond the scope of this video, but it should be highlighted that Wheeler is willfully comparing a city with well below the national average here. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the United States had an intentional homicide rate of 5.35 per 100,000 in 2016, compared to the United Kingdom's 1.2. To be clear, the murder rate in the United States is not lower than that in the United Kingdom, and a brief outlier in 2018 in the comparison between two selected cities is absolutely not sufficient information to say that there can be no case for gun control.
In Australia, violent crime went up after the gun ban.
Now, on this one, I'm not sure what source Wheeler's using, and so it's hard to analyse the actual data being discussed. Let's give it the benefit of the doubt and say that there's probably at least a reasonable degree of truth behind what Wheeler's saying. Note that I do this not because I believe that you should inherently believe unsourced claims, or even because Wheeler's indicated any reliability up to this point, but because that isn't the most relevant part of the statistic that's been selected here. The key is that we've moved from mass shootings where 4 or more people are killed and no other crime was happening, to all crimes including firearms, to all murders, to all violent crime of any sort. The New Zealand proposal is to restrict access to automatic and semi-automatic firearms in order to reduce mass shootings. An increase in the amount of pub brawls and whatever else is being lumped into the violent crime statistic is not an argument against that premise in itself, even if you believe that people are less likely to commit violent crime if a healthy percentage of the population is walking around with Sig Sauer MCXs on their legs.
In cities here in America with higher rates of legal gun ownership, the rate of violent crime goes down. In the cities with the strictest gun control laws in America, the rate of violent crime goes up.
I'm finding it hard to source this one. I can find some articles and op-eds about Chicago having a high total count of gun violence, even though Illinois has had reasonably high levels of gun control by United States standards, but these tend to be based on total number of crimes rather than per capita rates. Ignore the fact that guns tend to travel from parts of the country where they are legal to parts of the country where they're not legal, etc. If there's such undeniable consensus as Wheeler presents with these facts, then it shouldn't be so hard to find things which agree with her claims. For a more in-depth discussion of related claims, please check out the Washington Post article in the video description.
In Texas, actually, concealed carry permit holders are more law-abiding than police officers.
This is based on another crimeresearch.org post, this one from 2015, which compares cases of police misdemeanors and felonies between January the 1st, 2005 and December the 31st, 2007 to permit revocations for Texas permit holders in 2015. Now, the first thing which probably jumps out at you is that the comparison is between a 3-year period in the mid-2000s and a 1-year period about a decade later. But more insidiously, the data for police is based on the number of cases being compared to the total number of officers. So one officer who's arrested multiple times or affected multiple victims will be repeatedly counted in this, even though they only contribute once to the total number of police officers. And the Texas permit holder revocation, on the other hand, is not only limited to counting a permit holder once, it also only includes reported crimes which have been prosecuted and resulted in the permit being revoked. PolitiFact goes into much more detail about the reasons that this comparison is, let's say, unreliable. But again, dodgy comparisons from a biased source using questionable methods about an issue unrelated to the idea of banning assault weapons, presented as if it were part of the case against what Jacinda Ardern actually said. Okay, now we're going to a quick-fire round of gun control methods which might reduce the rates of mass shootings. Now, most of this isn't relevant to Ardern's actual point.
You can draw a line and say that that does not mean that you need access to military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles.
So, let's cut to the counter-argument against that. Also, it means you don't have to look at the pictures of children crying after a school shooting, which I guess Wheeler put in for emotional impact or something, I don't know.
What about AR-15 bans? Nope, that wouldn't work either. Only 2.5% of homicides overall.
Hold up. We're back to talking about all homicides again, not mass shootings. The question was about controlling semi-automatic and automatic weapons to reduce the risk of mass shootings. So for this one part of the video where it seems like Wheeler's going to specifically address what Ardern said in the interview she's ostensibly responding to, we've already gone off the rails.
Only 2.5% of homicides overall in the US every year are committed with rifles, and AR-15s are just a subset of rifles.
Okay, so I thought we might be on to general conclusion and arguments, but we should address that first, AR-15s are not specifically what Ardern's talking about. The best data I could find was a paper called Criminal Use of Assault Weapons and High-Capacity Semi-Automatic Firearms, an updated examination of local and national sources. This found that 2 to 12% of guns used in crime were assault rifles, most estimates say less than 7%. 13 to 16% of guns used in murder of police officers were assault-type rifles. 22 to 36% of crime guns were either assault weapons or high-capacity semi-automatics, and that assault weapons or high-capacity semi-automatics are used in up to 57% of mass murders, although it does specifically say that the data on this is very limited. Now, again, Ardern's point is to do with the use of
military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles
in mass shootings. But we have lots of other gun crime too. Doesn't actually negate that point at all.
There are tens of millions of legally owned AR-15s in the US, so what percent are used for crime?
Now, I want to give credit where credit is due. This is actually an argument against the point that Ardern raised. The argument goes that most people who have automatic or semi-automatic weapons don't use them for criminal purposes, so why restrict their access to guns? I want to make sure to include this section because while I find actual rates of gun owners who own these sorts of weapons hard to compile, and we've repeatedly seen through this video a disregard for the actual underlying data, and while Wheeler is here talking about AR-15 specifically rather than what Ardern suggested, and while Wheeler is talking about total number of guns, not total number of gun owners, the fundamental thrust of the argument is sound. The number of owners of these style of guns who actually use them for mass shootings is low, and so why should their right to own a gun be taken away for the sake of preventing the relatively small proportion of owners who then go out and use them for killing sprees? Now, I personally think that the most relevant statistic would be the number of owners of these kinds of guns versus the number of people involved in attempted killing sprees using them. And yes, I do think that it would be fair to include cases like the STEM School Highlands Ranch shooting we discussed earlier, where one person died and 8 more were injured, although data for cases like this seems definitely harder to collate. At that point, it becomes a case of deciding what your personal cutoff is, and what the acceptable victim-to-owner ratio is over which action needs to be taken. But fundamentally, we have a point where Wheeler is talking about the same thing as Ardern was, and making an actual argument against it. So I think we should spend some time appreciating that.
What about background checks?
Oh no, we're off again.
Well, Nazi Germany...
Oh no. So, from here, Wheeler returns to listing other kinds of gun control and her views on them, with asides about how you shouldn't trust the IRS or the FBI, and ends with,
Madam Prime Minister, if you ban guns, or if we in the United States ban guns, then only criminals will have guns.
So here we are again. There may be valid concerns about how to actually enact and enforce gun control, but this is just a reiteration of a well-worn catchphrase, as if the fact that it's snappy makes it necessarily true, as if the studies which she's referenced were actually about banning guns instead of things like why we should stop schools and hospitals being gun-free zones, and as if New Zealand's Prime Minister had proposed a blanket ban on all guns.
The shooting at the Second Christchurch Mosque was stopped by a law-abiding Muslim man with a legally owned firearm. Imagine if that Muslim man hadn't been armed.
Side note, you don't need to tell us that the person who stopped it was a Muslim man several times in the same sentence, but this imagine if rhetoric, while I'm sure it feels very emotive when you're writing it, also neglects the fact that the good guy with a gun, as the sloganeers would put it, was not actually defending himself with an assault rifle, which is what has now been banned, in case you forgot again. In closing this video, I would like to draw a distinction between Wheeler's approach and this video here. I'm not discussing this video and then pretending that you can extrapolate from this to all people who are against gun control. I'm not saying that by examining Wheeler's misrepresentations we can debunk all pro-gun positions. I think it's clear from just watching the original video that the selection of results and the frequent hopping around between qualifying criteria is deliberately misleading at best, and that Wheeler herself has questionable credibility when it comes to these matters. What I'm mostly aiming to do in this video is highlight one example of Wheeler deliberately misrepresenting and cherry-picking statistics to support her point, both as a reason to be wary about issues presented by Wheeler in general, and also a cautionary tale about statistical abuse to keep an eye out for on both sides of any debate, including your own. If you're arguing a point and using sources to back this up, don't selectively pick specific cases to argue against, and if you find yourself having to move the goalposts at all, let alone from sentence to sentence, then take a few minutes to relax and just reflect on why you're so invested in what you're saying. It can be tempting to gotcha with some source that appears to support your point, but if that selectively picked doesn't cover what you present it as or is not consistent with other results in the same field, you should analyse why that is. Make sure that if you say something, it's an honest representation of the facts to the best of your ability. My friend and I have definitely had online arguments where in retrospect I've not gone to appropriate lengths to make sure there weren't other viable studies contradicting the results of surveys I've cited. This is something that after watching Wheeler's video I'm going to be more careful of in future. Because I don't want to look like this. I don't want to give the impression that I'm using statistics to try and befuddle, distract and lie to you. But there is a second distinction between me and a friend arguing semi-publicly on each other's Facebook walls. I believe that you should be held to even higher standards if, rather than talking to people in person or somewhere online where both sides are being represented, you're instead making a talking head video where you're speaking from perceived authority and deliberately crafting a bite-sized, propagandized narrative to sway people who believe that because you've hand-wavingly referred to the results of certain studies you're representing the range of research. Well, she couldn't say if it wasn't true. She's got a logo on screen and everything.
And that's my final point.